we're going to have to start our next panel because this is Bergen Exchanges and we have no time to waste. So,
hello. Hi. Nice to meet you.
So this panel will be on children and the law. This is another panel about the agenda of the Bergen Exchanges for the next 10 years. So I'm going to introduce you to our panelists before I give them the word. But first, I would like to thank all of you for being here. I'm Larissa. I was a guest researcher both in LawTransform and at DIPA. And it's a real pleasure to be moderating this panel with people that I admire so much and some who I had the opportunity to work with. So we don't waste any time. I'm going to start presenting and giving the word to Professor Marit Skivenes, who is a professor here at UiB in Bergen and the head of the Center for Research on Discretion and Paternalism, DIPA, who has been a close partner to LawTransform on this first 10 years developing projects on the child rights. And I believe so will keep on being a really great partner on the next decade. So Professor Marit, can you comment a bit on the research opportunities available or within reach to push the field of child rights and the law forward in understanding the state of children's rights within and between countries?
Thank you so much, Larissa, and thank you all for being here and participating in this session on children and the law. And as you saw in the introduction, we have a huge amount of children in the world. Just kind of think that it's 2.4 billion. That is just a kind of a quarter of the population. And in that light, if we talk about urgent issues for research, we are really, really under-researched when it comes to children. Of course, there are really good research done within health, and there is a lot done within education, and there is definitely research ongoing. When we look at, for example, data, when we look at numbers, statistics, immensely difficult to get a good overview of what's going on. So we know that the World Health Organization and UNICEF have done things. But let's kind of, if we go more into the global view on law and children, we do see that, for example, huge global variation in how governments are able to and willing to protect child rights or children's rights. And of course, just to study the mechanisms of why some governments are successful, even under poor and difficult conditions, and others are not, I think that is one important research area. A second one is, of course, to go into cultures. We have very different views on what a good childhood is, what is family, what is risk for children, what to expect from children. And I think that going into that area, we will have to discover much more on how the global view on children are actually able to fulfill the rights of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Because that is one convention, all children have that and those rights. But when it comes to the practice, we know that that's not happening. And I think part of that is related to culture. And for example, we can see in studies that we have done at our research center, we can see that there are huge global divides on what is seen as a family for children, and if a child cannot live with their birth or natural parents, where should they then live? So I think that is just kind of very clear indications on some research area we can pursue. The third one is, not surprisingly, the courts. So what's going on in courts when it comes to children, and when it comes to decision-making, we have some examples recently when we are here in Norway on how the European Court of Human Rights, how they have made decision on child protection system and our intervention into the family. And we can see that when we look at all those cases, children are very little present in those cases. Child protection are usually about children and the risk for children and how you should tackle and kind of provide for these children. But what we see then, as an example, and I think that this is also something we detect in other projects, children are not visible in these cases. And I think that that is, of course, a very important research agenda to understand why, and also the impact it will have to include children in a higher degree. I just want to talk about, we have a project ongoing on constitutions, and a reason for why we are doing that is, of course, that we haven't looked that much on children's place in the constitutions across the world. And here there is an amazing data set, so we will expand a bit more later on. The fifth and final research area I will point to is, of course, children's voices. So both on the input side, when we are making legislation, we are making laws, are we listening to children? Are we able to include their rights, their interests, and their values into what we are making legislation about and policies about? And secondly, of course, when we are talking about those decisions that are concerning children, how are we able then to make them take a part in their own case, in their own welfare, and have a say in their own life? And we do know that there are huge, huge deficits just in those few countries that we have looked at, for example. So I will kind of end it there, Lisa, and yeah, I think it was good on time.
It was great. Thank you so much. So kind of continuing what you just presented, Professor Jill Barrick serves as a distinguished professor of social welfare and the Zellerbach, I don't know if that's right, Family Foundation professor of the University of California, Berkeley in the US. And you two have been working together on the Constitutional Child Rights Project. So I was wondering if you could elaborate more about what you already know about this and what you still hope to achieve with the project.
Happy to. Thank you, Larissa. So welcome, everyone. Good to see you, and thank you for having me. We've been working on a project with Marit, with Larissa, and with Siri over the last several months, as Marit suggested, looking at constitutions across the world. And so if you look at the written constitutions of different nations, there are 193 of them. And the question is, where do kids show up? Do kids show up? And if so, where and how and in what context? So just to give you a flavor of some of those findings, we're finding that sort of remarkably, I would say, coming from a country where children don't exist in my constitution, so maybe that's why I was surprised, about 84% of countries do include children in one way or another in their constitution. The countries that don't, United States, Canada, Australia, Tanzania, Tobago, Lebanon, Israel, a few more, most of them are older constitutions, and so there's some historical legacy probably relating to that. But then the question is, well, what does it look like when you see children show up, besides maybe just mentioning that children should be protected or should have rights? About 40% of the constitutions suggest that children should have a special protection. And that's very much in line with the UNCRC, the convention, which argues that children have a special vulnerability and they do need to be protected by states. Where you see issues of children come up, it's usually about 4 different topic areas that they show up, and so they come up around special protection, protection from abuse or neglect, protection in terms of having a right to education, having special judicial rights. Those are some of the primary areas where you might see children show up. But then if you look a little deeper and you say, okay, well, they are visible, but what does it really mean to be included in a constitution? And are there really rights that are being protected? And if so, who is protecting those rights? And so that's the next layer that we're now grappling with, and that sort of lays the framework for future research. Because part of what we see is that in many cases, children are mentioned as having rights, but they're rights that the parents are obliged to ensure. And so is that really a state right? Is it a public right? Or is it a private right? And if it's a private right, then does the public state really have a responsibility? Or as the state simply said, we don't have responsibility. It's the parents' responsibility, it's a private sphere to ensure children have rights. So for example, about half of the countries that have rights enunciated relating to education, about half of them do say that it's a state's right to provide education. But about half of them say it's a parent's right to provide education. So is it a right or is it an obligation? And so that's one of the questions that I think we really need to sort of think through. The other is, we do this a lot in the United States. A state will create a law, and sometimes it's a law that's an enforceable law, but frequently states will write laws that are just resolutions. Well, what's a resolution? A resolution is just an aspiration. Kids should be healthy, okay. Kids should be free, whatever that means. Kids should thrive, I agree. But who's responsible for that? That's an aspiration, that's not a right. And so part of what we're trying to parse through now is in these constitutions where children show up, where is it an aspiration and where is it a right that is enforceable by law? And so that's the next generation of research that we need to press, and then in pressing for that, see if there are ways to press our states to ensure that when children show up, they actually have enforceable rights.
Thank you so much. So to continue this discussion, we didn't clap for Marit as well. To continue this discussion, I'm going to give the word to Satan Nabane, who serves as the Director of Programs and Research Professor of Law at the University of Dayton Human Rights Center in the US as well. And Satan, as an activist, not just an academic, has had a lot of experiences, especially, I think, with the guaranteeing the rights of young women. And I was wondering what are, on the subject, your perspectives coming particularly from the Global South, and what this research area really needs to do, what are our challenges, and what are our opportunities from now on.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm glad to be part of this. It brings me back to my first love. So I started as a child rights activist at the age of 8 in the Gambia. And so really centering, for instance, what you were talking about, you know, this idea about centering children's participation and voices. I was very much involved, especially when we were advocating for the Children's Act of 2005 in the Gambia, for instance, right? And I just wanted to add that as a personal anecdote to say that child participation obviously is important, it's central. I think, you know, it has kicked up, obviously, but I think part of the challenge, as you were saying, is really how do we even document it, right? Because I think even within the Gambian context, I don't think we sort of have any sort of documentation, right, about the processes that young people, children were involved in, what difference has it made, what impact has it made, and that kind of thing, even though I'm a good example of the impact, right? But I think it goes beyond that. I think on a personal note, given both my interest in the scholarship, but also in the activism, I tend to be in both worlds, but also in relation to the main focus, especially around how politics and law is a major determinant in relation to sexual and reproductive health and rights, which is an area I am interested in and continue to work with. I think there is a need for, you know, further research, especially around not just norm setting and contestation around that, but how that interplay, especially both at the local, national, regional, and international level, right? Because I mean, in my own research, even around harmful practices, whether that's female genital mutilation or child marriage, I think there is need for more evidence as it relates to that. I was just from a Zoom meeting with members of the Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians presenting on female genital mutilation, the case study of the Gambia, where there was an attempt to roll back and decriminalize FGM for the first time in the war, right? And part of what comes out is that, especially given the Commonwealth and the varied nature of the countries that are part of the Commonwealth, there is the need to have more scholarship and interaction and conversation between regions. I mean, LawTransform and this space is an excellent space for that, but I do think more focus around that as well. I think the other area that we have started having conversations, especially at LawTransform, has been the issue of comprehensive sexuality education, right? Which we obviously know is politicized both within the African region, Latin America, but also the connections even with Northern-based organizations and how they tend to both in relation to the transnational movement of ideas, resources, as well as others. So we're hoping, hopefully, fingers crossed, that we'll be doing further research, and especially on globalization pathways, right? How those ideas transform, but also how we see that play out at different levels, both in international arenas, whether it's the UN, at the regional level, whether that's the Inter-American Human Rights Commission or the African Commission, but also locally as well and nationally, right? Thinking about teachers as well as others. And I do think there is space there, future research, especially thinking about education in the broader sense, whether that's menstrual management, whether that's, have other ideas, addressing sexual and gender-based violence related to school education as well. There is obviously studies around the barriers to accessing education, but obviously in certain geographical locations it's limited, but also from a law and politics perspective, I think it's limited in terms of the scholarship as well. And talking about geographical locations, I also think that I think there should be sort of a shift from even both in relation to for our focus. I know yesterday there was a presentation on child marriage, for instance, right? And there's this sort of perception, even in the literature itself, that child marriage is a global South problem. We know that child marriage is a US problem, right? But even the scholarship around that is limited, right? How do we then think about, especially in the next decade, right? How do we think about both conversations between the global South, the global North, but perhaps also shifting even in terms of focus, both in relation to the geographical location, but as it relates to whether it's humanitarian crises or fragile settings, as well as others. But I also think part of the takeaway, even thinking about all of these issues as well, is that issues of, the continuous changing context that we find ourselves will sort of also inform what we do, right? Whether that's the issue of climate, conflict, as well as others. But I'll stop here. I'm sure my 5 minutes is up. I could talk more, though, but I'll stop.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to
Oh, sorry, they didn't clap for me.
they're lazy now. After lunch, they're lazy. To go on in the discussion, I'm going to introduce Victoria Schmidt, who is a researcher at the University of Graz in Austria. And I was wondering if Victoria could focus a little bit. We talked a lot about democracy, and I know your research touches upon how democratic legitimation of children's rights occur and what the challenges are for it. So I was wondering, how do you see this agenda as of now, and what do you think we should focus on the next 10 years?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's a big opportunity to me to be here, to be part of this panel and the whole event. And I would like to focus on the trend that seems to be one of the most important for the next 10 years and probably for the next period of child protection. It's child's mobility. Naturally, it's about the labor migration and the participation of children in labor migration of their parents. And naturally, it's a huge movement of refugees around the world. And mobility of children is a big challenge, not only for the national systems of child protection, but naturally for the global vision of child protection. And it calls for revising our understanding of what means good child protection for children who are in the process of moving. And naturally, it's not about the physical or geopolitical movement, but it's also about the movement from one situation to another, like children from Ukraine, who experienced absolutely unusual consequences of being replaced in Western Europe. And I think that one of the main possible trends for the next decade for child protection is the possibility or impossibility to develop the named cosmopolitan child protection, which would be kind of the alternative to the national and transnational vision of children's rights and the ways how to implement these rights, also including this division in the public and private rights. And naturally, the problem is to find in each of the locations those potential agents and actors who would be able to ensure such sustainability of cosmopolitan child protection and ability to not only adjust children to the norms, to the expectations of the society, but prepare society to be more flexible to the needs of these children. And naturally, the main challenge for such much desirable cosmopolitan child protection is the illiberal movements, and this clash between different sides of this illiberal view, because different illiberal movements, they are very good with involving the issue of child protection and children's rights in their agenda. And it's a big manipulation by public opinion in different countries, even in the transnational level. But also it's easy to organize moral campaigns with a very final result in hatred speech against those adults who produce the suffering for the children. And the question is how to map these options for cosmopolitan child protection, how to make cosmopolitan child protection manageable. And I think that now we're in process of revising our methodologies, our research. And probably one of the main problems for this research is the fragmented understanding of child protection in the most vulnerable regions. So I mostly focused on Eastern Europe and post-socialist countries, and I could say that it's extremely difficult to find information about the child protection in the former Yugoslavian countries. So what happens there? What are the historical prerequisites for practicing good child protection in this region? What is the consequences of the Yugoslav wars, and not only, what's the consequences of the socialist period in these countries? And it's not only one example, so I could say that we probably need to develop more sensitive, more nuanced view on this historicized view on child protection. And another issue, naturally, is how to put in child protection the nexus of class, gender, and race. So as somebody who was involved in the assistance to refugees from Ukraine, I could say that one of the main negative consequences was the re-establishment of racial hierarchies. I mean, in European societies regarding to refugees from Ukraine, and I think it was one of the main challenges how to address it, how to prepare children be equipped to struggle against different forms of discrimination, how to be in touch with those who should be responsible, but in this moment participate in this discrimination and couldn't recognize the options how to develop some alternatives. So I think that mobility of children, cosmopolitan child protection, and the challenges from the side of illiberal campaigns against child protection are in the focus of the agenda for the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think you all brought amazing insights. I would like to open the mic for questions and comments. I would like to ask whoever asks a question that you come very close to the mic so that we make sure that the sound is captured.
So first of all, thank you for this subject. I'm always the one that points out the dark side of the force, right? And so and I wanted to do it in two areas. So one is that the increasing claims for child protection are being increasingly used by autocratic governments against their parents. So I'm thinking in the US, when under the Trump administration, when their international consultants told them that children had more rights at the borders than their parents, the result was they separated the kids and the parents, deported the parents, and didn't keep track of whose kids they were. And a very similar thing happened in Hungary under EU law, where they decided kids had more rights. So they would put the parents in detention without feeding them on the theory that parents could leave whenever. But the kids would be removed from their parents several times a day to be fed separately and then brought back, because the worry was that if they fed the kids in front of the parents, the kids would share the food. And so then you have this problem of the kids being fed. Anyway, so that's one topic. The other topic is just on LGBTQ rights, where both in the US and also in Hungary, my two countries that I live in my head at least, they've been using the protection of children as a reason to ban all kinds of LGBT displays in public, including for adults. Right? So I guess I'm wondering if there's a flip side to the question of children's rights when it's being really instrumentalized as a way of actually disciplining the adults. The end. Here.
Thank you. I was just wondering, in the research that you did on the, 100 constitutions or whatever, the trends that you saw with respect to. So I wonder if there is something to be gained by classifying something as children's rights vis-a-vis the content of the right itself. So to give you an example, in the Indian Constitution, we always had a recognition of children within labor rights, but due to the movement on right to education, we now have a constitutional right to education for children up to the age of 14 years. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, is it, because I have the same concern that Kim has mentioned about the use of children's rights to actually sort of negate a lot of the rights that have already been there. Abortion is not an issue in India. It has never been. We've had safe abortion to be funded by the state since 1973 under the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act. But, we have, however, in recent times, because I guess it has become such an issue everywhere else as well, that we are seeing some tricklings of that kind of conservative mindset coming into India. And so I was just wondering if this is, to your question, is the right against the state or is the right against parents? I think that originally, as conceived, rights were against the state, and of course we've recognized many non-state actors and corporations and so on. But I think there is something really problematic about sort of making the rights, because often women and children are considered vulnerable groups within the Indian context, and to separate the two, as we have seen in the case of abortion or in the case of LGBTQ couples, as was mentioned, is a real challenge and is a real problem.
Thank you.
So 2 quick points. One is, I think probably in terms of constitutionalism, my sense is in this area, you're probably more likely to get to the understanding that the constitutional system has of children by looking at the case law, probably around education. Because that's exactly when the triad state, parents, is it state's property and they get to decide the ideology in which, or is the educational sphere like the public sphere of children in which they become citizens? And so I think that's the more fruitful area probably. And then a question. Spain reformed its civil code, not the constitution, to include citizens' duties. So now we're not just talking about citizens' rights, but about citizens' duties, including the duty to be respectful towards your siblings and parents, to cooperate in the home in accordance to your age, to the society, to the respectful use of public and private utilities in the educational system. I think that's a promising venue because, I don't know, but I get students, who just came out of being children, and the feeling is they only have rights. And I think that's wrong. But I also think that doesn't do good service to this idea of children's voices in the understanding of children as citizens, and rights come with responsibility. So is there a project there, if already or maybe for the next 10 years?
Hi, thank you so much for such an interesting panel. Sorry. So I thought the discussion around children's rights in the context of labor migration was really interesting. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the protection of rights of children who travel alone in the context of European countries, which are a group that have been increasingly attacked by the far-right movement and political parties in several European countries, such as Spain. So I was thinking if you have encountered any of that. I know there has been a couple cases in the European Court of Human Rights. So just wondering if you had any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been a very exciting and insightful panel. I have a question for you all. In the frame of your research, I'd be curious to know how you think about children in the context of climate change and highly polluting industries. Specifically, the legal mobilizations that we have witnessed for the past years have increasingly used either intergenerational justice or the rights of future generations to mobilize against state inaction or corporate actors. So I would be very thankful to your thoughts about A, how efficient this has been, and B, what are the upcoming horizons of keeping on using these type of narratives in terms of the advancement of children's rights, but also in the retrofitting of the content of the rights themselves. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Are we still singing when we grab the mic? I'm kidding. Thank you so much for a really great panel. I tried to write it down so that I don't get too confused because this topic excites me. My name is Naledi Mpanza Miguel, and I think you're all superstars. And I think thank you for sharing, Satang, on your early involvement in spaces that have an influence on child participation in law or policy. So I think I've got 3 questions. Can figure it out. So my question has to do with how do we navigate the transition from children and participation to young person and youth? Whose duty is it to prepare children to take a seat at the table and not just be represented at the table? And how do we do it through avoiding, obviously, tokenism? And then, is this defined by age? So I think that the big one is, how do we work out that transition? Because, I mean, it would be great if everyone was like Satang and they were like a child activist. But I think there could be, there's the space, I think, if there isn't one already, to sort of think through how do we work through that transition. Thank you.
Thank you again for the panel. My question was more about if you could reflect a little bit in the challenges of addressing children's rights in the context of ongoing conflicts. I'm thinking in Palestinian children in Congo, children in Sudan, how to address this in a scenario of constant dehumanization of the entire population, but especially children, where they have like the highest rate of, genocide against everyone, but especially children. Things. And we are all, aware of the situation, but if you could give some reflections regarding this, how to address this in a scenario of contest and terrible dehumanization. So thank you.
There's another person.
Hi, I just wanted to ask you to maybe comment on the political rights of children or adolescents, because in the previous panels we've been talking about the role of so-called Gen Z in the recent protests in Bangladesh, and perhaps it's a larger conversation about how many non-violent campaigns have been driven by young people, but on the other hand, as I see it in some non-democratic contexts, the incumbents try to diminish the demands of the protesters, saying that it's adolescents, teenagers, minors who kind of don't know what they are getting involved in, and I think that even the leaders of these campaigns sometimes ask underage people not to participate in those campaigns. So do you think that there are going to be any maybe developments, both legal and maybe not legal in this field? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So many interesting and different questions. I'm going to give each one of you 3 minutes to comment on whatever you want regarding the questions, and then we can keep on the conversation on the cafe break.
Okay, thank you. I see that you're looking to me. So
yes,
I will kick it off,
follow the
and
same
I will try to address some of them. Not all of them are kind of in my area, so I will then pass it over to you. And also likewise, Satang, you were 8 years old and they were participating. That is just amazing. So let's be clear on that. I think I would just start with misusing children's rights, or to think around how you can then put children's rights up against parental rights. And I think that is some examples there which are really horrible. as you describe them. But at the same time, I think that we can see this as children being something which is used and misused all over. So we have seen a lot, and we touched partly upon Victoria, is that we see that when you are against the state, then you have the concepts of family. So I think that there's a part of this is that you are just giving children's rights another content. And then you are kind of thinking that this is how we can then create conflicts, and then we can gain our aims in that regard. So I think that this is a trend that we see in many countries, actually, which has also been religious-oriented, and it's also been then on especially on the right side of the political scale. Also, it was touched upon when we talk about unaccompanied minors and asylum-seeking minors, and I think that that is an area which is really important, and I can see that many countries are just avoiding the whole topic. That this is even a state as Norway, which is very wealthy, and we like to pride ourselves that we are so good in children's rights. But still, that is a topic which we put aside, and again and again and again it comes up to the agenda, and it's then declined, and we say that, well, that's how it is. So that is a disgrace in so many ways as well. And then I just want to pick up on a last topic, and then I will pass the baton further. And that is the question about transition to youth. And participation as a young adult. And I think that that is just very clearly related to being a participant when you are a child. And that is also related to culture in a way, because you would think of children as someone that you need to always protect or to decide for. You have this paternalism that is very often exercised. But if you already as a young person experience to be a participant, either it is in your own life, or it is in the school setting, or is it in the municipality or in the system, that will be a training in being a part in a democratic system. So I think that that is a kind of a line that you will then educate and train your children to it. And of course, there is also much going on these dimensions. So I think I will just kind of pass on to the next then.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Jill, can you?
Yeah, there are many wonderful questions, some of which I have no idea how to respond to. But one of the themes that I hear is sort of this dialectic of children's rights as liberation versus children's rights as oppression. And I think that that's one of the difficulties of our discussions about children's rights, right? We generally would say that infants need protection. Infants really don't have the agency to engage in a liberatory framework of having rights and expressing them, because they can't express very much. But a 17-year-old may need far less protection, but needs far more liberation, because they have the agency and the capacities to chart their own future. The problem with children's rights is it includes 0 and 17 and everything in between. And so so when we think about children's rights from protection to liberation, we have to think about it in developmental terms rather than as a universal, because it can't be universal, can't be universally applied in the same way. But the challenge then is that there are many examples, I'll just take some from the United States, where children's rights get played upon as liberation in some contexts or as oppression in other contexts. So, for example, children, some might argue, children should be free to have an abortion if they should choose to do so. They are 17, 16, 15, younger. They should have the liberation because they have the agency to determine their own future, and so their children's right is to make that choice. And others might argue that children have a right to be to have their health protected, and so they don't have the right to decide. Their parent has the right to decide because of their role in protecting their child's rights to health, however a person might characterize health. The same could be argued around child marriage. We have a number of states, were just described, where child marriage is absolutely legal. Why? Because children should have a right to decide if they want to marry, because they should be liberated to make that choice. Whereas there are others who say we should have laws against child marriage because we wanted to protect children's right to their health and safety. So the language of protection of rights gets very easily caught into this web of, are we talking about rights to liberation or rights to protection? And it's developmental, but it's also political, psychological, sociological, cultural. And so that's, I think, part of the dilemma is when we think about children's rights, which children are we talking about by age, by other marginalized status, whether that be race or class or gender identity, sexual orientation, and then also this question of development and also the frame of protection and liberation. Where do we stand when we think about children's rights? So it's a contested idea, it's a contested topic that I don't think those of us who are interested in children's rights may have done a sufficient job in articulating that this territory itself is pretty messy.
Thank you. Now Satan.
Okay, sure. Thanks, everyone, for your questions. To Naledi's, I thought Naledi was going to talk about the issue of which is linked to Kim's point as well, the issue of the politicization, especially around, even within the African context, around the debate on legal and physical gender change, right? And obviously, the emerging jurisprudence that we've also seen around intersex children, even coming from Kenya, it's not my area, but it was, I think, also a case study that was done as part of the previous political determinants study as well. But I think when looking at global trends, I think there is definitely some interrelating factors and interest there as well. On the issue of, I did mention climate generally as something that will be contextual to the type of research agenda that we have going forward as well. I think it's pretty interesting, even as we think both globally with the UN now, with a right to clean and healthy environment, what that looks like in reality, but also at the regional level with in the African region, where, for instance, with the African Charter, we also have the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, who have been having very early but also emerging conversations and consensus documents around climate and its intersection with children's rights, right? So, I mean, I'm sure there is, a research agenda or some sort of connections there as well. And talking about the African Charter and to your point about rights and responsibilities, I think that's fantastic. We should do a research around that, because I also think, even from the African perspective, the African Charter is sort of the first international human rights instrument that had a provision on responsibilities, right? And what that looks like, even as we think about culture and how children are raised in culture to be respectful, to know that my right to swing my arm ends where somebody else's nose begins, right? And I haven't looked, but I haven't really seen articulation, research, and scholarship around, these sort of perspective as well. And then, I have 2 minutes. No. You should have time. But yes, on the last point on the transition to transition from, child participation to youth participation, I think you brilliantly answered that as well. But I also think, and that's the thing, I mean, as an activist that sort of started as a child rights activist, went into young people's issues, youth issues, then went into women's rights. I mean, I still do child rights when I do child marriage and FGM, right? But I also think there is no definite process where there is sort of documentation and learning, especially on the process of how people shift from being, a child to a young person, and even within the African region, it's a bit weird because then Africa compared to, obviously, it's international, there are different variations as to what the UN considers in terms of age, who's a young person. In Africa, youth goes all the way to 35. What is the impact of that, and how do we do research, especially around a certain category of folks as well? But I think these are all interesting areas that we should jump on and do research on. Thank you.
Thank you. And to finish, Victoria.
Yeah, so I think that it's very important to follow how all this contests related to children's rights are embedded to the context of other rights. And for instance, as for the Kim's questions, there is a big conflict between the understanding reproductive justice in the disability movement, the feminist movement, right to give the birth and right not to give the birth. And I think that many children are involved in this conflict in a direct way, especially those who are placed in institutions and whose representatives could make decisions about such rights. And probably it is time to think about how to connect these mindsets together in order to provide better protection for the children, and also how to provide the opportunity for the children to express their opinion. So it's the main problem. And I think that one of the main challenges, one of the main obstacles for praxis in children's rights, I mean, everyday praxis, is that many of the psychological techniques or social work techniques, they are just not ready to be aligned with changes in understanding children's rights. So I experience many children who are under pressure of in-betweenness and very conflicting way of being between different identities. And actually, they need to sacrifice part of their identity in order to be aligned with expectations of society. And majority of psychologists and social workers are unable to help them to pass through this experience. And in this way, I could only think about that children have the right to reality in particular way, but also they have the right to change this reality, but how to do it. So I think that, it's a little bit tricky question about how to use and misuse children's rights, how to prevent misuse in children's rights, but it's about how to connect it with the wider context. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So thank you all for watching it. I hope you guys are as fascinated by these amazing women as I am, and I hope we can keep on this conversation. And we still have some final panels today before the annual lecture, who you're all really looking for. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Larissa. Thank you.